All right, we're recording. Before we get recording, I want to make sure that I set my stopwatch. Hold on, all right, 1 second. I'm an invalid. Stopwatch. Start. All right, cool. Hello. Let's see. So we're going to go to the second and third component of this second unit. So this will cover one sort of mathematical. So the second component of this lecture is about how we test hypotheses to understand the evolution of sociality. And then the next two components will be reviewing kin selection, which you guys are probably already familiar with, and then group selection, i.e. multi-level selection, which you guys are probably somewhat less familiar with. I'm gonna go turn off the AC real quickly. Which did not work. All right, okay. So there are three general ways that we can test hypotheses about social evolution. One, we can use natural variation and sociality in the natural world to test for associations between levels of sociality and environmental correlates, and levels of sociality and various kinds of performance outcomes to see whether or not certain kinds of environments favor enhanced or reduced sociality, or whether or not there are certain kinds of outcomes with the evolution of sociality that are reliable. And these are just using natural variation to test for those associations. And experiments, which you're more familiar with probably, or maybe you're familiar with both. And then we'll talk about various kinds of modeling approaches to evaluate hypotheses about social evolution. All right, so first is the natural variation approach. So natural variation basically says, as an approach, that either different species or different populations of the same species or different individuals even within a population will exhibit varying levels of sociality. So some populations of even a given species might exhibit grouping and other populations won't, or that closely related species, some will be highly social, some will be intermediately social, and some will be less social. And so basically you can use this variation across space or across species to say, okay, are there certain ecological correlates that reliably forecast the evolution of sociality? So for instance, if you were looking at a population of halictid bees, sweat bees, and you were looking at different populations and you found that in warmer climates, they exhibited weak levels of eusociality, i.e. they had castes. And then in colder climates, they didn't have castes, and so they lived more of a solitary or subsocial lifestyle, where it was just a single reproductive female and her offspring that she rears. Well, because you have that variation between, say, high elevation and low elevation, or cold environments and warm environments, you can ask, okay, presumably something about those different environments favors one kind of social structure versus another. And if you have replicate units, i.e. different mountains versus lowlands that you're comparing to each other in paired contrasts, you can use that to infer whether or not there are general associations between temperature and sociality and the sorts of correlates that, that go along with it. So for instance, we might find that the females from the warmer environments that have higher levels of eusociality and have sterile workers, we might find that those are the same females that mature at a smaller body size, or maybe they have a larger net reproductive output. And so we can begin to try to make hypotheses about which of these elements might be drivers of sociality versus which ones might be outcomes of high levels of sociality. And the same thing happens for interspecific comparisons. So intraspecific, by the way, means within a species. Interspecific means between species. The problem with all this natural variation approach is that it's not an experiment. You don't actually know what's driving the phenomena in front of you, what causes the bees at the top of the hill to have a different kind of social structure from the bees at the bottom of the hill. Right? You can make guesses, you can make inferences, you can test for associations, but it's always possible that other factors that you haven't measured, that you haven't accounted for, are actually the driver and are just associated with what you think the likely driver is. So you might spend your whole life thinking it's temperature driving this contrasting social structure between high elevation and low elevation. And you actually find out it's all about the fact that there's a more diverse plant community at the lower elevation that's driving everything. And because you had an initial hypothesis that was all about temperature, you just never had an open enough of a mind to be able to discover what was really driving enhanced sociality. So intraspecific variation looks at different populations of the same species, akin to my halictid bee example that I just provided you. And so you might say, hey, like at the top of this hill here, there might be a different kind of social structure than at the bottom of the hill. And ideally, you don't want one hill, because if you find that there's differences in sociality at the top of the hill versus the bottom of the hill for just one hill, you don't really know if it's even that gradient of that hill that's driving it, right? So ideally you have multiple hills and you can compare the bees from the top of the hill and the bottom of the hill and paired associations across multiple hills. So you can say reliably something about the environments at the top of these hills is driving or is associated with the enhanced evolution, or in this case, a decreased evolution of sociality, because at least with the halictid bees, generally they're more social in warmer climates, i.e. lower elevations at the bottom of the hill. You can also, so let's say you're not lucky enough to have those bees that have different levels of sociality within the same species, you can also compare across species. So hypothetically, you could look at many closely related species of ants or wasps, and you can use this variation between species to test for the same association. So what if you find that there are multiple independent evolutionary origins across the phylogeny of particular strategies? We'll say the dotted line here hypothetically is the evolution of pleometrosis, we'll say, or eusociality, or we'll say pleometrosis, we'll say founding of multiple queens. Well, you could use this phylogeny and say, okay, if each of these dotted lines was the evolution of pleometrosis, i.e. forming a colony with multiple queens versus a single queen, then you could say, all right, is there something with these species, these red dotted lines here, the stem species, is there something special about them that's consistently associated with this pleometrosis? You might find that they live in particularly desiccated, harsh environments like desert habitats or where there's dense soil, so that it's hard for a single queen to found a colony on her own and have a reasonable chances of success, versus if there are multiple queens working in unison, then it at least increases the odds that the society will establish effectively, even if it turns out that turn out not to be the most dominant of those queens. So basically you're using these independent origins of some behavioral trait across the phylogeny to infer what environmental correlates might be the drivers of sociality. Something else you might do is you might say, okay, do we know reliably if there's a certain kind of ancestral trait that gives rise to these dotted lines? So we'll pretend like this black line is another kind of trait, which we'll say is haplometrosis. So founding a colony with only one queen. And then we'll say that these red lines are instances where they're now queenless societies. They don't have queens at all. All right, so you can use this phylogeny here to try to figure out, okay, is there a certain trait or state that gives rise to pleometrosis, the founding of a colony by multiple queens? Well, if you go back and you use inferential statistics across the phylogeny, you can say reliably these red stems reliably go back to ancestors that are thought to be the black condition, i.e. haplometrosis. So by using this phylogeny and comparing closely related species, not only can you test for associations between the contemporary environment and certain kinds of social structures, but you can also try to infer what was the precursor to the contemporary social structure of interest, which in this case would be haplometrosis and not a queenless condition, which makes sense because if you're in a queenless condition, then you probably aren't going to suddenly evolve the tendency to form a society with multiple queens. Presumably, you at least want to evolve that other thing first. And then by contrast, you might be able to infer that these queenless conditions likewise come from a haplometrotic ancestor. I don't know why I chose to talk about haplometrosis and pleometrosis over and over and over. Those are very fancy words, but you're going to learn them again. So haplometrosis, founding a colony with one queen. Pleometrosis, founding a colony with multiple queens. I didn't think I was going to cover that this early, but whatever. Oh, the same caveat with the intraspecific variation with the hill example with the halictid bees, same thing holds here. Even though we have independent evolutionary origins of our focal trait, too bad, so sad, we still don't really know with a cause-effect inference what the driver was. We can just say what the driver was. We can just say what's associated with it statistically now. So this is just a fancy phylogenetically corrected correlation. We're not going back in time and changing the preconditions of our focal trait and observing what unfurls over the next hundreds or thousands or millions of generations, which is what you would want to do under ideal circumstances, but alas, no one has yet invented a time machine. And if there were one, we would probably be using it for lots of fiscal gain and probably not figuring out the evolution of pleometrosis. At least if I were a betting person, and I do bet, that would be its primary use. Financial gain, possibly retribution, and then maybe secondarily humanitarian efforts. All right, experiments. Hooray for experiments, right? An experiment allows you to have cause-effect inference. So you have controls, and then you have treatment groups. You have many treatment groups, so you can finally isolate the factors that are driving the phenomenon of interest. Hooray! So maybe you could cause experimental lines of social insects in laboratory to undergo warm conditions or cold conditions over multiple generations, and you can see whether or not you can cause certain kinds of social structures to evolve under those conditions, or whether or not if you take all those halictid bees from out there in the wild and you bring them into laboratory and you rear them under a common garden, either all in hot environments and cold environments, you can see whether or not certain social structures fare better or worse at colder or warmer temperatures in laboratory, where you don't have other confounding features like there's more precipitation at the top of the mountain, or there's more diverse communities of plants at the bottom of the mountain. There are more competitors at the bottom of the mountain. There's more physiological strain at the top of the mountain. So all those other forces, you can just ablate all of that, and then you can isolate just that variable of interest, right? Hooray for experiments. So the problem with all that is that it can be unrealistic. So you can isolate that, oh my God, there's an advantage for heightened levels of sociality in warmer conditions in laboratory, right? But what if your conditions that you create in laboratory are too hot or too cold or are just one stock temperature, when outside it varies temporally across the day. So say you set up one temperature for the northern portion the higher elevation, another temperature for the lower elevation. For many sites, the variation within and temperature at a site within the course of a day, between night and day, will be as large as differences in the mean temperature at the top of the hill and the bottom of the hill. So your experiment might be totally unrealistic. It might fail to capture completely relevant and important portions of variation that occur in nature. You don't know. Which is why, in an ideal world, you would combine these correlative approaches in the field that tell you what natural associations in life are like, and then you would just accept that those are correlations. Then you would take another set of studies that you would run experiments, and you would bear in mind that yes, in fact, your experiments are not totally realistic and fail to capture parts about the environment that would be helpful or possibly important. But then when you wed them together and they start telling you the same story, the same outcomes, the same drivers, the same information, the same inferences, then you begin to feel more confidently in your views, your conclusions, I should say. All right. And then sometimes it's impossible to do an experiment, or it's unethical. Let's say I wanted to figure out what the evolution of sociality was for contrasting social structures of mountain gorillas in Africa. Or no, I wanted to figure out, let's say I wanted to figure out something like, how does succession, the replacement of dominant males, change the social relationships between females of mountain gorillas? Well, one approach might be a correlative approach, where I would go out into the field and take fastidious notes, and I would camp in some very inhospitable environment and be rained all over, and I would write down detailed notes about different kinds of social groups, and some of them will have males that undergo a succession where a dominant male is replaced by another male, and some groups will stay temporally stable, where they'll keep their dominant male around, and I can write down detailed notes and compare those two different kinds of groups. But that's all correlative, right? right? There are lots of differences between groups that have succession and ones that don't, that aren't just the succession events themselves. So who knows how those female relationships change as a function of the dominant males either persisting or being switched out. But maybe I could run an experiment. Maybe I could orchestrate a tragic slip for those dominant males for a subset of the group. Wouldn't it be particularly powerful if I could just eliminate the dominant male from 6 groups and then have a faux sham treatment where I pharmacologically put those males into a coma and then let them come back out or something like that. So I would murder one half of the males using my choice strategy, and then for the others I would have some sort of procedural control, and then maybe another 6 groups I would have totally unaltered, so like let them just do their normal thing. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, one, odds are I'm not going to be able to find 18 discrete groups of mountain gorilla to run any sort of study on. 2, no one's going to give me the permits to murder a bunch of endangered species, individuals of an endangered species. So the experiment's not possible. It's unfeasible in terms of the level of groups you would need, and it's impossible in terms of logistics and legality and ethically, right? So no one's gonna let you do that. So experiments, hooray for experiments. They're so powerful, but they can be unrealistic, overly simplistic, and they can be impossible or unethical. Theoretical modeling. Hooray for theoretical modeling. So theoretical modeling has 2 general categorizations that we're going to talk about in this class, but there are lots of finer distinctions, and these things aren't completely discrete. So there's a simulation-based approach, and there's an analytical-based approach. So theoretical modeling, a simulation-based approach, basically gives little digital organisms, in this case, they would be like Tasmanian devils, and you'd give them a world that is actually a bunch of little cells, like a checkerboard or chessboard or whatever, and you'd have a very large, almost infinite landscape where they're interacting, and then you give them interaction rules, like the probability of dying, how they age, probability of surviving as they develop, the probability of them getting into conflicts, recruiting in and out of populations, and you are particularly interested in the role of different kinds of combative structures in the transmission of tumors in Tasmanian devils that can transmit infections from individual to individual during agonistic disputes. So they can bite each other's faces, and one kind of cancer can, the same cell lineage can move from one Tasmanian devil onto the other, right? And so, because no one's going to let you go around to endangered Tasmanian devil populations and give them a bunch of cancer, you're going to have to do something else. and theoretical modeling allows you to create in silico populations of Tasmanian devils that have different kinds of social structures, which might not even occur in nature. You can create variation that doesn't exist inside of these in silico populations. And then you can play out little worlds over and over and over and see what happens to the transmission of tumors and the demographics of the population of Tasmanian devil in a way that would be unethical, impossible, and infeasible for natural populations using a correlative approach or experimental approach for that matter. Because you can create variation that's not there, and you can conduct experiments in silico with different runs of the simulation with different parameters that wouldn't resemble any variation that occurs in nature. Analytical solutions. So the cool thing about simulations is that you can just make so many rules. You can make the little in silico world so satisfying, right? You can determine every little thing that goes on, and you can vary them all, and you can run simulations for however many generations. Hooray for simulation-based approach. The problem with a simulation-based approach is that in order to run all of your beautiful little simulations, you need a supercomputer under normal conditions. And it turns out supercomputers, although they're abundant, almost every university has some sort of supercomputer block or access to it, right? CompuCanada, I think, is the big juggernaut in Canada. But you're not going to have a lot of time on that supercomputer, and so you're not going to be able to run all the simulations that you want. So it could take you weeks or months to run a really satisfying, complex set of different simulations with different kinds of social structures and the evolution of these tumors and population demographics for the appropriate number of generations that you would like. That could take weeks, months, whatever, and you might not get access for that. So if you simplify how you're going to parameterize everything, you can use an analytical solution, which basically says, okay, we know that real life is really complicated. We know that simulations are very satisfying. I hope that's not my car. Okay, but analytical solutions basically say, okay, we think there are just a small number of variables that are particularly important for the system, and then we organize those variables into a set of differential equations and solve them. And that gives us really beautiful sorts of semi-intuitive phase plot type outcomes that allow us to figure out, okay, if the world were incredibly simple and just the small number of features that we think are important in real life were the only things that mattered, what would the outcomes be for the system? The nice thing about an analytical solution is it's incredibly powerful, it's highly mechanistic, but you just can't make it that complex. Because if you try to make it too complex, very soon you can't actually solve the set of differential equations. They become insolvable. So, modeling and theoretical approaches allows cause-effect inference. You know when you set up your little simulations, you know when you set up your set of differential equations, you know what forces are responsible for what outcomes. It's all in your mind, it's all a mathematical expression of your hypotheses in your brain. It doesn't say what's going on in the real world, but it does say if a world existed like the one in your model, what would happen? So it allows a thought experiment that allows cause-effect inference. But they can be unrealistically simple. Your differential equations might have 4 or 5 terms that you think are important. In real life, there are innumerable numbers of things that can happen in life, and so you're never going to be able to put that into an analytical solution. And if you put that into a simulation-based approach, it could take human lifetimes to try to figure out what happens in the outcome of those populations, and then even when you get those outcomes from those little in silico populations from simulations, you don't know what did it, really. You know that when you jiggle the parameters, the following thing happens, but you don't really know why that happened because you let it sort of run and percolate, and then this thing got vomited out at the end. You might be able to infer, but if you made a very complex system, it begins to become as complicated and difficult to predict as life itself. And so the beauty of having theoretical modeling, these thought experiments, almost becomes as opaque as trying to figure things out in the real world, which is very, very complicated. Anyway, the other nice thing about modeling is that it allows you to do things that are impossible. No one's ever going to let you go around and run experiments on giant societies of humans and conduct experiments on a city level for most kinds of questions evolutionary biologists want to ask. That turns out to be rather taboo. Orca whales or things that have giant pelagic movement behavior, like it's impossible to study an organism that has a global distribution, right? Or what if you're studying an organism that lives in the bottom of the sea and not like the Little Mermaid, like bottom of a coral reef, but like in the abyssopelagic and miles deep environments like coelacanths or something? You're not going to run experiments on those. You're not going to be able to do correlative approaches on them because you probably can't find enough of them. All right, or what if the organisms that you want to study are extinct? Them's the breaks, they don't live any longer. Can't study anything about their sociality unless you do thought experiments. You can take inferences that are rather indirect from deep sea sonar, or tracking a small number of individuals, or correlative-based approaches from human societies from demographers, from anthropologists, or archaeologists that are able to infer small glimmers of what the kinds of social structures might have been in long extinct archosaurs. And you can then take those things, put them into your theoretical models, and they'll vomit out something that will give you some insight that if the organisms were like these things that we think that they're like, what would the outcomes be? What would their social structure look like? What would their caloric needs be? What would be the, would they be cooperative breeders, or would they have alloparental care? Or how would things like changes in the world's climate from the Triassic to the Jurassic, or the Jurassic to the Cretaceous, how would that have a corresponding effect on the kinds of social structures that we think these organisms had? I think, yeah, okay. So hooray, so I said how wonderful theoretical models are, then I said basically they're crap, and then I walked it all back and said that they're useful in particular instances. How long have I gone? Oh my God, I've gone 25 minutes and I've basically covered only 1/4. Well, it turns out I'm only going to cover 1/4 of this. I hope that this is intriguing to you. I'm actually really enjoying talking about this. I'm still wearing my pink shirt because I filmed this one in the afternoon from the same day that I filmed the first lecture. I'm going to upload it now to Avenue, and yeah. All right, yep, I'll go over kin selection and multi-level selection in the same lecture next week as the first lecture, and that will be kind of a juggernaut lecture because it's a lot of content, and it turns out to be a field that is close to my thematic core. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Take it easy. Godspeed. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye. Oh, wait. I like that. I stopped the stopwatch. I therefore think I've stopped recording.